China, 1961. A dying man, once the richest in Southeast Asia, his fortune built on rubber. At the end, they read out his will. A museum, funded. A village, rebuilt. The schools, endowed. His children, nothing. 30,000 men had once worked for him. He died without a dollar to his name, and he had planned it that way. Not lost, given away. He had a genius for making money, and he poured a fortune into things that would never pay him back a cent. Why? He was born Kah Kee in 1874 in Jimei, a village in Amoy on the southeast coast of China. His father was an ocean away, having sailed south to Singapore into the rice trade, the way the men of that coast always did. The fortune was made overseas. The family stayed home, waiting on it, in letters and in silver. So the boy grew up on a promise that one day he would make the same crossing and a business would be waiting for him. At 16, he crossed. He found his father's rice shop on the Singapore waterfront and took a place behind the counter, learning the trade from the floor up, the ledgers, the suppliers, the local dialect that closed every bargain on the docks. He was good at it. Then his mother died, and he sailed home to bury her. He was gone 2 years. He came back to ruin. In his absence, the business had come apart. His father had spread himself thin, rice, property, milling, and the ventures were hollowed out from the inside, embezzled and mismanaged. By 1903, the shop was finished, and what it left behind was not an inheritance. It was debt. A staggering amount of it, owed to the local moneylenders. Here's the part that tells you who Tan was. Under the colonial law, none of this was his to carry. The firm was his father's. The creditors, his father's. The collapse, also his father's. A son could have walked away clean, and most would have. He didn't. He took on every dollar of it, not because anyone could force him. A name that paid was worth more than the money it owed, and that name was all the wreckage had left him. In his own words, "We Chinese always pay attention to being true in word and resolute in deed." So at 30, he started over. With nothing but that name and the trade he had learned behind his father's counter. He looked for what was selling. Canned pineapple was the boom business of the day. Cheap fruit, sealed in tin, shipped to the tables of the British Empire. Tan scraped together a stake and bought in. A pineapple cannery. 7,000 straight dollars, about 100,000 today. The cannery was in profit after 3 months. In 2 years, the boy who had come back to ruin was making money of his own. To supply the canneries, he bought his own land. 500 acres of jungle, cleared and planted with pineapple. Then he found the thing that made him: rubber. Half a world away, the automobiles were taking over, and every one of them rolled on rubber. Demand was exploding. Malaya had the soil. A handful of Chinese planters had already made fortunes. Tan planted it in the same ground among the pineapple, and he didn't stop at growing it. He tapped the trees for the raw sap that rubber is made from and turned it into finished goods: shoes, tires, household items. The land, the rubber, the factories. He owned all three, the whole chain from source to sale. They called him the Henry Ford of Malaya. By 1925, Tan stood at the top of the colonial economy. 15,000 acres of rubber, 30,000 men working for him, 150 offices, 5 continents. His fortune, 7.8 million Straits dollars. The better part of $100 million today. Remember that number. No merchant in Southeast Asia was richer. That was the empire he built. And even as the empire grew, the profit didn't all go back in. Not into more rubber, not to his own children, but to schools. A teacher's college in Jimei, the village he had left at 16. And a university in Amoy, the first in China funded by a private citizen. But the Great Depression gutted Tan's empire. It came for rubber from both ends at once. The price of rubber fell from 35 cents a pound to 7, an 80% collapse. In Detroit, the engine of the automobile age, assembly lines stopped. Car plants shut. The foundation of Tan's rubber empire shuddered. And the finished goods, the shoes and household items, all of them, died too. Both halves of the empire, raw and finished, killed by the same slump. Then his creditors called it in. 4 million owed, 2 million owned. In 1931, they took over the company and kept Tan on, not out of loyalty, but because his name was the only thing keeping 30,000 workers from bolting. They paid him a wage to be the face of a company he no longer owned. 3 years later, the creditors wound the company up and sold it off piece by piece. Land, rubber, factories. The richest man in Southeast Asia had lost everything he built. Through all of it, one set of checks never stopped. When the collapse came, the creditors had done the math. The schools were a drain. Cut them, they said. And still, year after year, money crossed the sea to a teacher's college and a university in China. The money was his. Every month, the men dismantling his empire cut him a paycheck, and every month he sent it on. For 16 years, Tan funded the schools alone. Not a board, not a government. One man carrying them on the back of a rubber empire, and then carrying them after the empire was gone. Enterprises can be closed down, he said. Schools can never be closed down. At home, the story goes, his wife walked to a local rice mill and asked the foreman for a ration. His family rationed rice. His schools got the checks. In 1934, the rubber empire was wound up. The salary stopped. By every rule of arithmetic, the schools should have closed with it. They didn't. Beyond the empire, the creditors seized sat a smaller business, a biscuit factory. That was never part of the wreckage. It stayed in the family, in the hands of the son-in-law Tan had raised as a protege. And it kept doing what the rubber empire once had, a share of its profits, year after year, going to the schools. The empire that carried his name was gone. The money to the schools was not. The business was finished. The man was not. Tan became the face of the Chinese diaspora. When Japan invaded China in 1937, he mobilized the overseas Chinese. He pulled shopkeepers, laborers, and clerks across Southeast Asia into the largest fundraising campaign the diaspora had ever mounted. He raised tens of millions and sent every dollar to China. Then the supply routes closed. Japan had taken the entire Chinese coastline, cutting China off from Allied reinforcements. China survived on a single road, 700 miles of switchbacks and gorges through the mountains from British Burma into China's interior. American arms, sent under Lend-Lease, were shipped into Burma. From there, they had to be trucked into China. But China was short on drivers. every able-bodied man already at the front. So Tan raised an army of drivers himself. Across Southeast Asia, he recruited, organized, and dispatched more than 3,200 of them, drivers and mechanics, ordinary men of the diaspora, sent to drive a mountain under enemy fire. To Tokyo, Tan was a dangerous man, financing and supplying a war against them. They wanted him gone. When Malaya itself fell to the Japanese in 1942, the hunt began. He ran Singapore to Sumatra to Java under a false name, carrying poison and a vow that he would not be taken alive. In 1945, Japan surrendered. Tan returned to Malaya. He had outlived the war. In 1950, he left Malaya and went back to the village he had left as a boy. He died in 1961, an ocean from the empire he had lost, and was buried where he had been born. At the end, they read out his will, every cent already assigned, a share to a museum dedicated to the Chinese diaspora, the same to the village of Jimei, where he was born, and the rest, far more than both, to the local schools. To his children, not 1 cent. For himself, he had kept almost nothing. Tan is remembered as a saint who gave everything away. That is the smallest part of the story. This was never charity. Charity is what's left over. This was the plan. The schools weren't what he did with his success. They were what his success was for. He had a theory about money. Hoarded, it did nothing. Spread, it grew things. If that sounds familiar, it should. Andrew Carnegie gave the idea a name, the gospel of wealth. The man who dies rich, Carnegie wrote, dies disgraced. Tan never needed the sermon. He had arrived there on his own, half a world away, and where Carnegie gave from a fortune that never ran dry, Tan gave his to the last drop. A century later, fortunes get pledged in glass towers and press releases, announced, applauded, and left to sit untouched for a lifetime. The pledge is the easy part. Tan did the hard part. He followed through. His wealth was gone. His giving outlived him. He built a fortune most people will never see in 10 lifetimes, and parted with every cent of it, knowing he would die with nothing. If it had been yours, the whole of it in your hands, would you have it in you to do the same? Let us know in comments. Subscribe to The Silk Ledger. We're auditing history, 1 chapter at a time.